Hey everybody. All right, so let's go ahead and I will share my screen and we will get started. A reminder, we are about to talk about rape and sexual violence. So if you need to not do this lecture, that is okay. All right. So when we talk about specifically rape's history and primarily still what it is today, you're talking about violence specifically against women. Um, and or those with female bodies. So, and the reason that is stems from a lot of things. It stems from the cultural ways in which we shape masculinity. It stems from the patriarchal roots of rape. So when you had a lot of more matriarchal society, um, rape was not near as present in those societies. You had a lot of also patriarchal roots in the ways in which women were considered property, were considered something that was owned by a man. So, and these have a lot of lasting impact, right? So when you think about the fact that marital rape was not possible in every state, I think the last state it was 1996. That's not that long ago. That's in my lifetime. Um, and probably some of yours. That's that's significantly um, the idea that a man could not rape his wife, or that a wife could not rape his her husband, and that significantly even now the majority of the laws fall onto the survivor has to be either unconscious, medically unable to consent, or mentally unable to consent. And those are the only capacities in which that can particularly occur, because there's this idea that a woman is signing over her body essentially when she gets married, and that is now to an extent property, and that has been perpetuated within our laws and our policies for as long as the US has been around. And that comes out of, again, those traditional gender relationships and this idea that violence within a home is something that was a personal problem as opposed to a societal issue. It's something that you needed to work out at home, right? So your book states that essentially feminism in the 1960s and that particular kind of social change was where this big shift happened to kind of make uh, rape and sexual violence against women a social problem. This is not the case. Okay, first of all, there's just so many things wrong with this statement. First of all, rape and sexual violence has been used as a war, a tactic of war for as long as wars have been a thing, which is considerably past our written history. And that goes to say that in and of itself, society thought that that particular action was wrong because to have done it to someone else and another culture is to degrade that culture. So there is this idea shaped around women as something of a virtue or something that is inherently that and violence done to them is inherently something that is wrong, right? Or and it is wrong for the wrong reasons in that particular case, and the way that it is wrong because you were making a slight at the men or making a slight at the culture or making a slight at the nation, depending. But because we can see that that particular thing was something that was specifically a war tactic against someone else, then there was already a societal perception that that particular act was wrong, right? That that particular act was an issue. Now, whether or not it was an issue enough for policymakers depended on and relied on who and what the group or what the setting was, right? So, violence against women has been a topic women have been talking about since the dawn of writing, since the dawn of word, since the point in which we have record. but you see it primarily being done in the voices of women. Why? Because this is something that kept happening to them. Survivorship was much more likely in women. And so women were much more likely to think that this was a bigger problem, a societal problem. And because of that, and because of the ways in which patriarchy limited their voices throughout history, it means that until about the 60s and 70s, which is when your book starts talking about it, it wasn't a problem for white men. Okay. The violence against women was a problem for Black men when they were considered or labeled as rapists all the way through extensive historical period, right? It was a problem for marginalized populations, especially racial marginalized populations, all the way back to slavery, all the way back to the Trail of Tears, all the way back to genocide, right, of Indigenous persons in this country. This has been a topic that has been a societal concern. The problem is whether or not it was a societal concern for those who made policy. And that didn't happen until that particular power was diminished a little, right? So the more women that got involved in political process, the more marginalized people that got voices that and had space for their voice to be heard. The more and more this happens, the more the violence is done to these individuals becomes a societal problem as opposed to a problem that is amongst the group and something that the group itself and that particular community is dealing with. But if a community is dealing with it, it is still a societal problem. And if it's something that is used politically against a marginalized population, it is still a societal problem. The deal here is that in order for something to change, the group that has the most hierarchical power has to also think it is a societal problem. And that is where we continue to have issues with conversations of rape culture, how power dynamics are used, how rape is used as a power dynamic. All of these things continue to be a problem that we will have to talk about in society because it is still something that specifically individuals who are higher in any kind of social hierarchy use on people that are lower in a social hierarchy, whether that be a man using that against a woman, whether that be a woman using that against, say, maybe a younger male, maybe a minor, like say, like for example, like within the school teachers to student setting, or maybe it's something that a family member does to another family member, etc. All of these things generally have a power dynamic, generally have a hierarchical dynamic that comes with either age, gender, race, economic social structure, disability status, etc., etc. All of these things have really big impacts on how these particular acts happen. Okay. And then I talked a little about before, and I talk about it a lot in the other lectures. So make sure that there's kind of an understanding of how rape and sexual assault are different and why those things and that language matters. All right. So social patterns of rape that he talks about in the book. Why are our numbers inaccurate? So he talks a lot about some of these numbers, and I want to talk about them for a little while because the numbers that he's using, A, are outdated. They're generally worse than what he reported. Also, there's lacking in the ability of certain intersectionality, so certain intersections of race and gender, certain intersections of class, race, and gender dynamics. So like all of these factors and these intersections of identities impact the likelihood that you will be a survivor of sexual violence. And we'll kind of get at that in a minute. And it also, the numbers are not inaccurate. They're not accurate for a number of reasons. Again, I lay out a crap ton of those reasons. And one of the presentations I give on this particular topic and one of the other ones, so I'm not going to harp on a bunch of them right now, but please see that one because those are incredibly important to talk about. And also you got to figure who's doing the research, how old the research is, where the research is being done, who's being talked to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there's also barriers in research because survivors don't always want to talk about their survivorship because they want to be known as other things, but also they might be healing from that. They may still not be wanting to acknowledge that. There's a number of barriers within getting these populations to have a conversation. And part of that stems from the damage that can be done from reliving or rehashing those events. All right. So patterns, you're much more likely to be sexually assaulted or raped by someone that you know or have an acquaintance with than you are to a random stranger in the street. You're much more likely to happen in urban areas or on college campuses, places where people are much more, a lot more people are in a lot smaller of an area, if that makes sense. So you're more compacted. And this is more likely to happen when you are younger, say and if you are a woman, specifically in your teens, 20s, even early 30s. Your class impacts your risk factors. So the lower social class you are, the more likely you are to experience these things. And it's seasonal. So you're most likely to see these things more often when people are socially out and about and engaging with other individuals. And that again falls down to it's more likely to be someone you know. And if you're out and about with the people you know, you're more likely to have that happen than you are in, say, winter when we all kind of shell off when it gets cold and decide we don't want to go out. And that's just because the interactions are more likely to take place in those settings. And then again, most of the time there's no weapon used. It's a matter of force. It's a matter of sheer body weight dynamics. It's a matter of substances being used to incapacitate, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So who's arrested for these crimes and who isn't? So this is something that is really misrepresented in your textbook. So you're talking about men of minority being arrested more often for this. But these people are also much less likely to have the social networking to get out of it. They're much more likely to have power and access that would keep them from being arrested or tried for this. And you're also much more surveilled by the police and much more likely to get arrested just depending on the color of skin. And we're going to get all up into that in the next chapter. But really talking about the fact that your economic status and your race massively impact whether or not you're arrested, whether or not you're tried, whether or not there's a case against you. And that again creates a setup where, of course, more marginalized men are arrested than white men, specifically white upper class men. Whether or not those things happen at that level or not. So if you look at the Harvey Weinstein and the level to which the trauma occurred before something happened versus maybe say or versus Brock Turner, right? Okay. And while Brock Turner only had the one thing happen, he almost got off for that. He did get off for that. He got like some probation or some junk. It was BS. Despite the fact that they had witnesses, despite the fact that there was video, despite the fact that this was just overarchingly wrong and didn't matter, right? Because he had the right social networking, he was the right social class, and he was the right race. Okay. Now you compare that to a poor, say, Black man, and he is going to be significantly more likely to be arrested, tried, and to have a much harsher sentence. And these things have really lasting impacts. I am not saying, do not hear me, that there should be no punishment or should no be any kind of trial or anything like that for those who um, do harm in that way to other people. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is much more likely that those who do harm that are marginalized identities to be tried in the social justice system than those who are not marginalized, who do not have marginalized identities. All right, so your author apparently has a profiling system for rapists and what gears or shapes their motivations. I think focusing on particularly this avenue of thing kind of dramatizes or creates this idea that this particular kind of criminality deserves a level of attention. Essentially, this is putting the attention back on the person who has done harm as opposed to creating resources or putting more investment into stopping those harms from happening in society and or to and or from maybe, how do I word this? While this is could be useful information for, say, a profiler who is going into a case, or maybe for a prosecutor who is trying to figure out a motivation so that they can try the case or what have you. The general public, and particularly if we're talking about a societal problem, we really want to get to the not the root of why an individual person does something, but the root of why a society would allow space for that, or how a society is creating or maintaining these systems of violence. And particularly, I would have much rather saw an entire section on rape culture and how rape culture happens within society than I would have see a profiling of all the reasons why people rape other people. And so I'm gonna get out of that, and then I would suggest going to see some of the other lectures on these kind of topics. All right, so there's a lot of trauma and re-traumatization within the criminal justice system when it comes to prosecuting or doing any kind of work with survivors. And there's a lot of different reasons why rapes are not often prosecuted to begin with. This is a crime that consistently is chosen to not be tried. And that's because, well, we're going to get into some of those reasons. Sometimes it's lacking in physical evidence, and that physical evidence is usually extracted from hopefully a SANE nurse, which is a sexual assault nurse examiner. I think that's what that stands for, who is specifically trained on how to do this in the least traumatizing way possible and work with the survivors. If you are in Kentucky, every county has at least one due to some work done by the by some fabulous humans. And a friend of mine at the Survivors Council, within the Survivors Council, in the Attorney General's office. This was a prior Survivors Council, though. And then the one they have operating now. And I can get you in touch with anyone for whatever county you live in. So please do not hesitate on your student resources list. There should already be listed who is in Richmond area and where you can find one in Lexington, possibly. I don't know if the Lexington one's on there, but I can get you that one if you want, because it's on a different list for a different university that I teach at. And then also, depending on when it is reported, that physical evidence might be lacking. If the person wants to shower or feels before they go, they're going to lack a lot of physical evidence that would have been gathered. And none of that is wrong. The survivor has a right to take a shower. They have a right to not go directly to a hospital. They have a right to not go get physically examined at all, given the fact that their physical autonomy has just been taken from them already. None of their choices are wrong. Their choices are exactly what they need in that particular moment. And you are never should or never going to hear um, me say that any survivor did something in their pathway to healing or their pathway or their process incorrectly. Um, there is a way the criminal justice system wants you to do it, and then there's a way that we as a human may need to do it. And that's, it doesn't matter if those do not connect or align. However, it does create an issue where it is much less likely to not be prosecuted. On top of that, we have a culture that remains and consistently victim blames, um, and will create reasons or find reasons for which that person essentially drew it on themselves or drew that violent act on upon themselves. Cops and judges um, are the judges of who and what gets investigated, which then, depending on their report, it will either be taken to the prosecutor's office to be reviewed or not. From that point, the prosecutor still have the overarching rule whether or not they want to prosecute something. And if they feel like the survivor is not someone who is that perfect victim, or someone who um, fought back and or was wearing appropriate clothing or was sober, or all these extenuating circumstances, if you don't check these perfect victim boxes off, there's a large chance that the prosecutor is going to reject it because they do not want to lose a case or take a case that they don't feel like they can win. And prosecutors are still overwhelmingly male, which has an impact. They're also overwhelmingly white and male, which has an impact. There's a considerable number of charges brought on by women of color against men that consistently do not get taken up by the prosecutor's office due to the fact that they feel as though Black women are not going to be able to appeal to a jury as a victim, which is absurd and wrong. And again, shows why, particularly, society still needs to have a lot of, to answer a lot of questions and have a lot of things be called out and dealt with in order to really get to a system where there can be any kind of consistency with prosecution of these particular cases. Again, it has to get to the prosecutor's judge or desk from the investigation. If the cops deem the investigation as not a crime, or that the rape didn't happen, or they do not believe the victim, then they can never make it to the prosecutor's desk in the first place. And that in and of itself, again, poses a two big, huge barrier stumbling blocks that someone has to get over in order to even get to a place where they might see a judge. Perceptions of rape in broader society are a struggle. So there's a lot of inconsistencies or incorrect myths, or there's a lot of perceptions that a lot of women make up stories in order to get men in trouble of rape or sexual violence, which overwhelmingly is incorrect, like statistically very improbable. It's not to say it doesn't happen. It's just that if you're gonna, I think it's less than 6% of the time. So you're looking at, if out of every 100 people that talk about this, 94 of them are telling the truth, but we're focusing on the 6 that might not be, and why that should outrank and essentially invalidate the other 94%. Then we're in and of itself having a conversation that is going to perpetuate that violence, because, well, I can just say that she was doing it because she was mad at me. So why would I not continue to do this violation of human dignity? And they also get drawn down to this he said, she said argument. And so when there is this lack of physical evidence, what ends up happening is that the prosecutor or the cop or what have you will be like, well, it's your word against his. There's no proof, blah, 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 blah. And that will again hit those barrier marks and or hit broader society and um, create issues. Um, there's also cross interrogation that happens within that court system, which causes this second victimization, or essentially having to relive or having to re-go through as a public defender or just a defense attorney goes through and essentially tries to tear apart your character, tear apart who you are, um, and invalidate your story of survivorship, and that is in and of itself really traumatizing. And so it's incredibly valid for people who are already facing autonomy um, issues of autonomy and issues of personal violation to not want to go through another one. And in so many ways, the legal system absolutely fails survivors. And again, part of that comes down to what we just talked about, and the other part of it comes down to these really big perceptions and miscommunications that happen within society as a whole that funnel down into these cases. All right, so when you talk about trauma, rape can have really lasting impacts for the survivor. It was super icky in the textbook that it got talked about how it impacts how a survivor's trauma will impact their husband or their partner or blah 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 blah. So survivorship, while it does impact relationships, and I'm not saying it doesn't, and it does impact those around them, the survivorship itself, the most harm is going to come to that person. And the person that needs to be prioritized in that moment is that person, not their partners, not whoever else they're with, not whoever else is around them, not their family members. The person who needs to be prioritized and helped is the survivor themselves. And I will say that again and again and again. And if you have questions on why I specifically say that and make so much of a note of that, please don't hesitate to ask. The trauma can come in the form of, it can be expressed in the form of a PTSD symptoms. It can be expressed in through depression, anxiety, at-risk behaviors, maybe having to do with substances, having to do with sexual activity, having to do with who we're around, etc. It can be people end up self-medicating again with substances. Some self-medicate with prescription medications, etc. And those things can have really lasting impacts. People also self-harm, and there's a higher risk of suicide. And then the re-traumatization of the legal system, of any kind of process, of any kind of having to tell their story to the people in their lives, to new partners, etc. All of that can have really lasting impacts, as it's something that makes a person have to relive what is likely one of the most impactful and in a negative way moments of their life, or several moments or period of their life, depending. And rape is incredibly prevalent in the media. It's incredibly prevalent in our news system. It's incredibly prevalent as a plot point in movies and TV shows, in all sorts of things. And because of that, it's something that someone has to come across their own stories or come across their own traumas and really negatively impact full ways. And so it's something that we need to kind of talk about as a society, again, as something that has this impact on individuals, on survivors. And because of our rate of survivorship of sexual violence is incredibly high as a society, it's something that we should be talking about far more. All right. So I'm gonna stop here, pause, and then we'll get into murder. Um, so again, take care of yourself, take a break, um, do something that will reset your brain, and we will get back to it. All right.